This is our amazing guest on Remote Daily today. Welcome to the stage, Anat Shenker-Osorio. Anat, such an honor to host you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And an episode with a fellow podcast host called Ezra Klein. Some of you might know him, a New York Times journalist. You called yourself a pathological, I have to read that again, pathological optimist. Pathological optimist. I was reading it, rereading it, saying it out loud. Can you share an example of what that means for you, like day to day?
Yeah. Well, I feel like you cannot do my job. You probably can't do a lot of jobs without being a pathological optimist. And what that means is the triumph of hope over experience. So we lose a lot. That is the factual truth. And when you work, especially in electoral politics, but even just in campaign politics where you're trying to move people on issues, it's not ambiguous. It's different than a lot of jobs. There's no sort of good try, right? You either win or you lose. And when you lose, if you feel things the way that I do and the way that the people that I respect and admire and work with do, it's a really big deal. It's a really big deal to watch, for example, people's basic fundamental rights that they have taken as given be stripped from them. It's a really big deal to watch the slate of laws that are being passed in the United States, for example, all over the place, that are really about curbing and taking people's fundamental freedoms away and picking and choosing who will want for nothing and who will know nothing but want. And so the losses are really consequential. You know that they are quite literally ruining people's lives. So basically, I operate from a place of thinking we're always going to win. I legitimately believe in every campaign that I
Wow.
engage in that we're going to win. And it's not exactly that I am sort of shocked when we don't, but I really do approach it from the idea that this is ours and that we can have this and we can actually make the world better, freer, fairer for all
Mhm.
people, no exceptions. And I feel like I just have to have that feeling. Otherwise, I can't continue to engage in campaigning.
Wow. I just heard Christina Amanpour say in an interview, a true leader focuses on the possible and the positive. And I think that's exactly what you do. You're a true leader. Your company, ASO Communications, that you founded 14 years ago, applies tools from cognition and linguistics to create stories that move people. And we'll talk about how you do that in a second. But first of all, why are you doing that? Why are you doing the work that you're doing?
Why am I doing the work that I'm doing? There's a saying from it's a Jewish commentary on the Torah, which is the Hebrew Bible, called Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the Father, and it's sort of the thing that I repeat to myself in difficult times, which I mean I can tell you the original Hebrew, but it translates in English to it is not ours to finish the work, but neither are we free to desist from the task. And this is the idea. I mean, I think in many ways, this is certainly obviously what Moses was speaking about when he did not make it to the promised land despite the wandering in the desert. I think that this is what Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about when he presaged his own assassination, that you do the work not because you have an expectation that you'll be there for the payoff, but you do the work because you really have no other choice. Chris Hedges said, I don't fight Nazis because I think I'm going to win. I fight them because they're Nazis. And maybe that sounds a bit overblown and grandiose, but there are people in our world, not just in the United States, but worldwide who are hell bent on our destruction. And certainly, if you're a person like I am who believes in climate change and its destructive capacity for human civilization, it's basically like you can't not do it. You can't not do it. There is no other choice.
So a lot of the work that you do is creating words, and it's so amazing to listen to you because you're such an amazing speaker and host and interview guest. Do you, as you pay so much attention to words, have a favorite word so far this year, maybe?
Oh, wow. A favorite word this year. Um, that's interesting. Wow, I feel surprisingly caught off guard, which never happens to me.
Huh.
You know, I don't know that this is my favorite word, but recently, yesterday, I was on a phone call with a whole slew of grassroots groups that are doing state-based work in the US, and I referred to something someone said as being orthogonal to something else in the conversation, and I got made fun of for like a good solid 5 minutes for how that wasn't a word that people use and how I was like presenting the GREs. So I don't know. I guess I'm going to throw out orthogonal, which to me is like a standard part of my working vocabulary, but apparently is strange.
Okay, as a not native speaker, I had to Google this. It is right angles. Is that correct? It
Yeah.
means
So,
and
sorry.
it means at right. Something is at right angle.
Yeah. So, generally, when people say, oh, I'm going to go off on a tangent, or that's tangential to what we've been talking about, you're used to hearing that, right? So, a
Yes.
tangent is meant to be somewhat connected to the present conversation, but sort of taking it in a different direction. That's generally people how people use tangent. Orthogonal, the way that it's used in speech, not as a geometric term, is there's still
Oh.
a basis. I'm going to jump off from the conversation, but I'm really going to like redirect it.
Oh, I think I do that all the time. So thank you for letting me
You're welcome.
catch you off guard. I hope. Do you enjoy being caught off guard, or is it more awkward?
Um, I mean, enjoy is a high bar. I know that I confused you by starting, well, you started with the pathological optimist, but generally speaking, like I don't know that I'm trying to get to enjoyment. I'm trying to get to like maybe serenity. Even that seems kind of inescapable.
The
I don't
committee.
mind being I do not mind being caught off guard.
Okay.
It is refreshing.
It is, and it is very refreshing to talk to you. Let's dive into how you do things because on your website, people can download handbooks. We just shared it in the chat um, with recommended messaging for really like difficult, various difficult topics: mass incarceration, right-wing scapegoating on race and trans youth, drug and opioid overdose, immigrant rights. Like this, I mean, these are just the hardest things anyone could talk about. And you create handbooks that include memes, narrative structures, style guides. It's an amazing resource. I wish I would have found it way earlier in life. And Liz just shared in the chat with everyone, asocommunications.com/messaging-guides. Can you choose just one of the guides for us and take us into the process of how you actually create a guide like that?
Yeah. So let's start, for example, with immigrant rights, which is a body of research that I started working on a long, long time ago in 2011, and then beefed up by doing a whole slew of work in Australia, where I've been a whole bunch of times, and our family actually lived in 2015 in order to work on this big project on people seeking asylum, which is kind of the equivalent of immigrant rights in the United States. So, generally, in our projects, we begin with an analytic stage. This is where we look at status quo discourse. How are the advocates trying to talk about it? How is the opposition talking about it? How is it addressed in social media? For topics that are relevant, how is it sort of brought up in popular culture? That's true for some things, for some other things. For example, once did a project a long time ago on perceptions of pregnancy, used tons and tons and tons of pop culture examples because that is a topic that gets covered extensively in Us Weekly and People and, celebrity culture and so on. So, with immigrant rights, one of the things that I noticed in the initial language analysis is that there was very little immigrating in the immigration debate. So,
Mm-hmm.
there were harms, there were horrors, there were laws, there were stipulations, there was motivations to leave, there were motivations to come, but very little about moving. So after that first analytic step, which I liken to the you are here dot on a map, this is the range of ways people currently reason. This is how we're currently trying to make this argument. Then we generally do cognitive elicitation interviews with advocates. This is where we try to pull out of people, what do you wish people believed? How do you wish that they reasoned? And when we asked folks in these conversations, I did this work with a political strategist named Brian Clayton and a bunch of others. And when Ryan was doing the interviews, because he did them in this case, and he asked all of the immigrant rights advocates, how would you describe who an immigrant is to a 4-year-old child? Unsurprisingly, most people said a person who moves, because in fact, an immigrant is a person who moves. You're an immigrant, I'm an immigrant, I'm not born in the United States either. And so then when we start the next phase, which is the experimental phases, first qualitative generally and then quantitative, we formulate hypotheses around what we think will work and don't. And I had a hypothesis going in that the standard way of arguing about immigration in the United States, which is America is a nation of immigrants, except for Native Americans, we've all immigrated from somewhere, which is essentially asking people to put on their American hat, to reason through the lens of their national identity, and to come, we hope, to a less xenophobic conclusion. Surprise! It turns out that nation of immigrants is actually an extraordinarily unhelpful framing. Why? It's insulting to Native Americans for reasons I think are obvious, even when people remember to do the caveat. It's insulting to a significant number of Black people because it implies a volition in the movement that was not there. And it's not rooted in the lived experience of most of your audience. Most US adults were actually born in the US. That's just how the numbers break out. And when you break it down further and you think about your persuadable universe, people who are not advocates on this issue, people who do not share sort of strongly pro-immigrant values, but rather the people who are conflicted, they are even more likely to have been born in the United States, not come from abroad. Mm-hmm. And so you're talking to them about an experience that they have not had. An experience that maybe an ancestor they've never met, never talked to, or, don't particularly think about has had. Instead, when you talk to them about moving, the United States is an incredibly mobile society. Unlike Europe, for example, people here tend to leave their homes at age 18 to go attend university somewhere or to go get a job. People here move a lot. They tend to move multiple times throughout life. And so we constructed a message that more or less went like this. The same is true today has been throughout history. People move. It's hard to move. To pack up everything and go to a new place takes courage. Immigrant Americans move here for the promise of freedom and opportunity in this country. We have a saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. America's supposed to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, and that's a good thing. So let's make it that way. Mm-hmm. When you contrast that people move message with America's a nation of immigrants and we should respect immigrants and welcome them here because that was our history, there's no contest. The people move message is much, much stronger because it's rooted in the fundamental value of freedom. If I can add one more point, I realize this is a long answer. When we then were looking at this topic in Australia, there was a similar kind of status quo discourse where people would say in the advocacy sector, we're all boat people. We all came here by boat at some point in history, because that's true even for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. So we did an experiment. We did a split sample test in a survey with a large enough sample that we could disaggregate results. Half the sample got a forced choice question between we can't take care of everybody and we need to protect and care for our own people first. So an opposition statement versus as Australians, we have a duty to people who come seeking asylum. The other half got a split sample between the exact same opposition message. We can't take care of everybody and we need to look after our own people first. And the pro message that said, as caring people, we have a duty to protect those seeking asylum. So as Australians, as caring people, contrasted against an identical opposition message. The people who heard the as Australians versus opposition message were much more likely to agree with the opposition message. The people who heard the as caring people versus opposition message were much more likely to agree with our side's message. In short, nationalism is not our friend. If you want people to have a less xenophobic feeling, you don't bring their national identity top of mind.
Wow. Wow. It's so fascinating. And just maybe to add one thing, just a little tiny footnote. You were born in Tel Aviv. I was born in Germany. And in Germany, people move, I think, maybe 4 to 6 times in a lifetime. And I think it's in the US, it's more than double than that. Is that a correct statistics?
I cannot be relied upon for this statistic.
Okay. It's just
Yeah.
fascinating because you brought it down to a level that everybody here understands, that everybody shares. And that to me is, I just learned a lot. So thank you for that. And you also talked about natives. And I think that brings us to your podcast, Words to Win By, which is such a great title. Each episode of your podcast focuses on a win, as you said in the very beginning, because that is what you work for, what you believe in, and what your life revolves around, a different progressive win that you are basically portraying. And the second season covered issues like Georgia flipping the Senate in Georgia runoffs and education strikes in Arizona and West Virginia. So you're really like looking around, just to name a few, and you have also been looking outside the country. So let's try to break this down. And I realized that this is probably a very tough question because everybody's asking you that, and it's maybe impossible to answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Are there patterns you see that make for a winning campaign?
Oh, absolutely. There are patterns. Um, Let me answer in the reverse first and say there are also patterns to losing campaigns. And the most concrete pattern, and this is my perennial joke about the left, and this is true because I work around the world. So my joke about the left is that I can reduce left or center left messaging all over the place to 3 simple sentences. This is like standard messaging, not my messaging. The first is, boy, have I got a problem for you. The second is, we're the losing team. We lose a lot. We lost recently, so you should join us. And the third is, this is the Titanic. Would you like to buy a ticket? And this isn't just for electoral. This is like the way we talk about climate change, the way we talk about poverty, the way we talk about encroaching fascism, the way we talk about refugees. I mean, the way we talk about the abrogation of women's rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's always, boy, have I got a problem for you. And shockingly, most people are not out shopping for new problems. They got 99 problems and they don't want yours. They're all set. And so while that kind of discourse is effective for activists, meaning people who are already politically engaged in the progressive arena, we love problems. We're like, oh, a new problem? Fantastic. Sign me up. I didn't realize that another thing was going to hell. I can't wait to hear more about that. But most people, that is not how they operate. And when I say most people, I want to be more specific and say ideologically inclined people. So people who actually agree with the progressive vantage point on these issues, but are not activists. They are not sort of doing much. They may not even be voting. If they're voting, that's kind of it, not much more. So what does work? Number one, number two, number three, number four, all of the things. If you forget everything else that happened today, the only thing to remember is say what you're for. Effective campaigns are framed around an affirmative demand as opposed to a don't, a stop, a can't, a get rid of, I don't want more of that. And that's really hard for people on the left because we are confronting such incredibly big and seemingly intractable nefarious forces. But what happens when we speak so continuously about our opposition is that we foment the cynicism that is actually our main obstacle. Yes, the opposition is formidable. Absolutely. I just, spent a lot of time earlier in the introduction talking about that. But our main obstacle is not that people don't think our ideas are right, it's that they don't think our ideas are possible. And so why bother even participating? And when we make it seem that, yeah, like, would you like to sign up for this lost cause? Most people are too busy for a lost cause, and I don't blame them. And so the pattern is that effective campaigns, first, they say what they're for, they actually make an affirmative demand. And second, and this may seem incongruent, if you have more than 5 seconds, so if you only have 5 seconds, say what you're for. If you have more than 5 seconds, which is most of the time, the second thing you have to do is call out your opposition and ascribe motivation. So, another common mistake among leftist discourse is a tendency to use what we call inagentive construction. So, this is wages are falling, poverty is increasing, children of color experience the least qualified teachers, climate change is altering our weather. Whenever we create sentences in which there is not clear human causation, it becomes incongruent for most people. If they can't understand that a problem is person made, it's very confusing to suggest that it could be person fixed, right? If wages are falling, I don't know, I guess they encountered additional gravity. They just like got heavier. I guess they, were eating a lot. Maybe they were sad and indulging their own feelings, and so they started falling. It's not true that wages are falling. A handful of wealthy people and corporate owners are choosing to withhold pay regardless of their profits.
Got it.
So the second sort of hallmark of effective messaging after say what you're for is call out the other
Mhm.
side, draw a clear contrast, and make sure that you ascribe motivations to why they're doing what they're doing. And then the final thing is present an affirmative, evocative, desirable vision that people actually hunger for. Or as I sometimes like to say it, if you want people to come to your cause, you need to be attractive.
Mhm. It's so you have to add a who to the what always.
Yeah. Yes.
So it sounds like you got it down. Like, and Anne is actually saying in the chat, how in the world, every word you just used was so accurate and clear. How in the world do you do that, Anat? I'm just going to pose that question to you. How do you do that? How is it possible for you to speak so clearly? I haven't heard a single from you since we started this conversation.
Well, now you're pretty much guaranteed to hear a lot of them because you just primed me to do that. How I do it, probably it's that I did 2 seasons of a podcast, and so I'm extraordinarily accustomed to talking to a microphone. It's also that these are ideas that I have held for a very, very, very long time. And I guess the third thing, and this is also a hallmark of really effective messaging, and another thing that is a big problem on the left, I often tell people we need to say fewer things and say them more often. So one of the facets of human cognition is that when we look in experiments, messages that are more familiar to people
Mhm.
are rated to be more credible, more reliable, more desirable, things that just strike that chord that you feel like you've heard before create what we call cognitive ease. Our brain doesn't have to reach for them. We sort of know how to fill in the blank. And so a lot of what I'm saying right now, I've said a lot of
Mhm.
times because it turns out you need to repeat the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over in the hopes that people will maybe have heard it even a single time, let alone be able to absorb it and repeat it.
Mhm.
So that's probably how.
Wow. Oh my God. How do we squeeze the rest of this conversation into 17 minutes? Let's talk about the future of work. I see two narratives at play right now, especially when we talk about office. One is, let's all go back to the office. Let's save our inner cities. We need proximity. We need serendipity. We need human connection because 99% of communication is nonverbal. And then there's the other narrative that says, screw the office. We want flexibility. We're caretakers. We have a life. Both of these sides have financial interests. They have PR firms. They have media outlets. They have pundits. Which one can win? What do you think?
Oh wow. I'm supposed to weigh in now. This is like the NCAA tournament. It's March Madness, but the word version.
It is
Um
March.
that is a difficult question for me because the way that my work works is, as I often tell people, messaging is the wrapping paper on a box, and you need to tell me what the contents of the box are. So, what I mean by that is when I'm doing a project with a client and they have to have a very, very clear point of view and a thing that they desire to get done in the world. And I'm just, unfortunately, I know my lane and I know the rest of the world is not my lane. So, which way of structuring work, and my guess is that it's intensely complicated and there actually isn't an answer in terms of what is best for people's well-being, and I would assume it's incredibly idiosyncratic to people, to industries, to, there are places that have intense, robust, adequate public transit outside the United States, because that describes very few places, arguably none in the United States when you factor in cost, where it is much more reasonable probably
Mhm.
to have an expectation that people be able to join together in an office space.
Mhm.
And I think that, yeah, I mean, I realize I'm punting the question, but it's just not my area of expertise. I guess what I would say is that I would hope that the determination of which one is going to win emerges out of what is authentically actually best for people, and therefore is situated inside of a larger conversation that if you're going to ask people or demand that people go back into a physical office space, then what else are you creating? Let's just take public transit because I used that example before, but what else are you creating in terms of accessibility of caretaking, resources for affordable after school for folks whose kids are, slightly bigger and already school age, the ability to actually get where you're asking folks to go without asking them to sort of do things that are prohibitively expensive or that are polluting.
There was a piece in the New York Times written by Jennifer Salai that where she said, "You are a believer in the power of generative alienation." I'm learning so many new words today. Sticking to a message that risks pushing some people away, so that you can figure out who the real sort of quote unquote persuadables are.
Yeah.
Is that something we could apply to this topic? Is that a good example here on the spot?
Well, in order to apply to the topic, again, you would have to be coming from a place where you are attempting to get something done, right? You have a strong point of view and you're on the side of, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so this is just a for instance, you're a work from home or die. I will never re-enter an office. You shall never, you shall take me screaming from this room that I am in presently kind of
I could
person.
say that.
Huh? That's
Yeah.
your point of view. Okay, so messaging, campaigning is only as good as the cause that it's attempting to enact, right? So you first have to have that cause. You have to have the thing you're trying to get done in the world, right? So in this case, in this example, we're saying the cause is no more going back to the office, screw you office people, just for the
Mhm.
purposes of argument and illustration. Um when I mean, I wouldn't argue that this is sort of the best example to illustrate the idea. I'm going to backtrack and then I'll come back and try to apply it to this if that really is the cause
Yeah. What
before
would
me.
be what would be an example
Yeah,
where you say this
so
is very clear and we all have
here's
heard of it?
here's a super clear example. A super clear example is when we look at um, universal single payer healthcare in the United States. So there is a knee jerk desire on the part of campaigners, and this happens every single time. We also see it more recently with the Biden budget and the desire to talk about how this will curb the deficit. Let me take the deficit one because it's very top of mind. So Biden puts out a budget. Obviously, the fascist faction that is in charge of the House of Republicans turns out that attempting a coup is not a disqualifying event in American politics. For those of you listening from abroad, we're just here to make you feel better about your own country. I feel that that's my permanent
Check.
role as an American. You're welcome. So Biden puts out this thing and says it's going to cut the deficit by however many billion or trillion. I don't remember the number. What we find in testing is that when you bring the deficit top of mind, as opposed to talking about what the budget is going to give you, the budget is going to ensure that when you open your tap, you can trust the water that comes out. It means the bridges that you drive across will last in perpetuity. It means that the clean energy that all of us deserve is ours for the taking, clean, locally made energy from the wind and sun. It means that our kids can be in loving care at prices that we can afford. It means that you get to go to the doctor, and when you go to fill the prescription, you're not in horror at the cost. So rather than talking about this is the stuff that this gives you, which is the Democratic brand advantage, bringing the deficit top of mind asks the listener, especially the conflicted listener, to say, oh, well, the way that I should evaluate this budget is, does it increase the deficit or does it decrease the deficit? And regardless of what is actually factually true, and this is very frustrating for us, facts don't actually matter. They're not persuasive to people. The Republican brand strength is this idea that they're fiscally responsible, even though they aren't, and that they care about the deficit. So now what have you done? What you've done is said, the conversation we ought to be having about this budget is who cares the most about the deficit? And regardless of what is and isn't bullshit, the association is that the right cares about the budget, or sorry, about the deficit, pardon me. And so instead of trying to please all, please none, which is the reason that you have a message that's like, this is a very responsible budget and it's going to cut the deficit, because you're hoping that somehow you're not going to piss anybody off. What you've actually done is handed your opposition the advantage by saying, we're going to debate this on your terms instead of our terms. Instead, if you believe in the power of generative alienation, as I do, you understand that the job of a message is to engage the base, to say something that your base doesn't just believe, but is willing to repeat.
Got it.
To persuade the middle and to actually marginalize people who will never agree with you. So that's an example of that.
How many times were you tempted to just say, dude, just let me step on a podium and say this, because obviously you're not getting there. And I have done this so many times. Why you're not, how often have you thought I should be in politics instead of that person?
I mean, I am in politics.
I mean, in an office, sorry, running for an office.
Oh, running for office? No, I would never wish that upon myself. First of all, this is the longest I have ever gone without swearing, and that was only because I forgot to ask you in the prep whether you're allowed to swear. So first of all, that's utterly disqualifying. Second of all, no, running for office, I'm I only come in one flavor, and it's candid. I basically operate on two different streams. I have the messaging stream, which is where I am able to produce and put out carefully calibrated talking points that are all about, getting people in with higher order values, making clear who the opposition is, and it's all very tested and controlled. And then there's the way that I actually talk, which is like, fuck the fascists. And so I can't run for office.
You actually wrote a book, don't buy it, The Trouble with Talking Nonsense About the Economy. And Van Jones said, this will fundamentally transform how we talk about the economy. So I have to confess, I have not read the book yet. But
well, that puts you in good company.
What kind of nonsense, though, are you referring to here?
So a lot of my work is in metaphor, which maybe sounds strange this far into the interview because it hasn't come up, but metaphor and in particular conceptual metaphors, which are like the metaphors that you were tortured with once upon a time in a language or literature class. They're like those, but they're different. They occur at a level of speech of which we aren't consciously familiar. So in many languages, and certainly in English, there is a tendency to talk about the economy in naturalistic metaphors. So you can hear this in language like, we have a recovery bill. The economy is on life support. It's healthy, it's unhealthy. We need to resuscitate the patient. So that kind of language, which implies to the listener in an unconscious way, which makes it really powerful, that the economy is a thing that's organic. It's a human body, for example. And the way that we reason about organic things and human bodies in particular is, of course, in cases of dire distress, you're in cardiac arrest, you need immediate attention. But for the most part, the business of daily living, breathing, blood circulating, brain waves firing, digestion, having someone there pushing on your lungs, right? Being like, oh, you look like you need help breathing. I'm going to help, you look like you need help swallowing. Let me just do that for you. That's not just invasive and annoying and painful, it's actually harmful. So when we construe the economy in naturalistic terms, and we see this in priming experiments, we actually make people believe that government intervention is bad. It's akin to me helping you swallow, and you're fine. You don't need any help swallowing. You've got it down. In contrast, metaphors that rightly suggest that the economy is a person-made entity, because, in point of fact, the economy is just a convention. It's a means by which we measure human activity, consumption, investment, work, output. That's what the economy is. It doesn't exist outside of people. You can't go hang out with the economy. It's not going to buy you dinner. I hate to burst your bubble if you were thinking that it would. So instead, when we talk about the economy as a vehicle, it's on the right track, it's on the wrong track, it's veering out of control. We need to take it out of R, out of reverse or Republican, and put it into D, drive. Then what we prime people with is the expectation that, of course, it makes sense that we have some sort of external management and decisions around, let's say, setting a wage floor to make sure that people aren't in utter poverty, regardless of how many hours they're putting in and how much their employer is extracting from them in profits. So that's an example.
When you are, you're about to go to Argentina, you're just coming from Australia. Is there a region in the world or a country in the world that you're specifically looking at right now or working in right now where that could serve as a model for everything that you're doing, where people really are a step further along the way when it comes to messaging and how it implies politics and how it affects people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say that there's a place that's nailing it across the board. There are certain places where surely there are much, much more progressive governments, and we can see a pattern of discourse. Obviously, New Zealand comes to mind. I was fortunate enough to be working with the Labour Party in the lead up to Jacinda's first win. That was when we were living in Australia, so it was what's considered a short hop to the extent that anything is close to Australia. And getting to sort of train them and collaborate with them. I think that there is a lot of the discourse that you can hear. And, many people, because she came onto the scene for a lot of us already in power, didn't realize that actually she came to power after a very long and concerted era of conservative rule. So it was by no means a shoo-in. It was by no means a given. It actually was a hard-fought campaign, a fascinating campaign that evolved over 6 weeks because her predecessor called it quits, Andrew Little, and suddenly she was the candidate with 6 weeks to spare till the election. So New Zealand, but I think in terms of evolution and more recent changes, I think Australia is a fascinating case. In 2019, they had a really, to them, shocking loss. The Labour Party was predicted to come into power. That isn't what happened for many of them. It was like the US 2016 moment where people were like, what just happened? That's not what we were expecting. And then they flipped it around, and in 2022, the Labour Party did, in fact, create a ruling coalition. They quickly enacted a really, really robust and impressive climate change bill. They're doing all sorts of things on the economic front. So I would point to that. There's been a lot of language change, which is really exciting. And the other place I would point to are various spots in Latin America. Brazil, with Lula's return to office and the ouster of Bolsonaro. Thank goodness for all of us. Thank goodness for the health of our planet and the Amazon. really exciting things happening in
Mhm.
Colombia, really exciting things happening in Chile, and really a resurgence of a left-wing populism that is also attendant to issues of gender, attendant to issues of
Mhm.
race, of indigeneity, etc.
Wow. Last question. And there's so much more to talk about when it comes to Latin America alone. So we need to invite you again because your partner in life is actually from Honduras. And there's a lot that you know and that you have experienced where we could talk about. So, mental note here. Last question. What is the best speech you have heard or seen or maybe even stood by recently?
Recently, um, wow, I should have prepped this one too. Um, you know, I'm gonna speeches that have really, really, really stood out. I think that the speech given by I think it was the editor of Everything Everywhere All at Once at the Oscars,
Mhm.
and just how beautifully and cogently he spoke about the fact of his privilege, but not in a sort of, oh, like I'm acknowledging my privilege and so I should get brownie points, but rather the way that he spoke about it without using that terminology, which I often think is actually not that helpful of a way to construe it, but rather as an incredible responsibility and an opportunity to really lift others up and to look around and to see which voices are not getting that first big break, which folks have been routinely shut out. Because, like all industries, I mean, I don't know an industry in the world that isn't built out of relationships. And the idea that it's not what you
Mhm.
know, but who you know, I've never encountered an industry in which that isn't the case. And so, because that is the way that the world of work is largely construed, we have to start looking around at the gatekeeping that is happening unconsciously and perhaps not even, it's not even unintentionally. It's like you don't even know what's going on because people aren't in networks. And I thought that he really addressed that beautifully.
Wow, I've learned so much over the last couple of minutes. I'll just try to break it down. So from finding the common, the relatable, like everyone is moving and talking about immigration to addressing the positive, the possible, the relatable goal instead of the negative, to adding the who to the what, to calling people out, not just saying what is happening, who is doing it, to looking further into the world, not only to Australia and New Zealand, but also into Latin America to actually find inspiring examples, to bringing it back to last weekend in the Oscars and watch the Everything is Everywhere speech. Anat, we learned so much from you in this hour. And Anat, we always ask in the end, is there anything we can do to support you? Is there anything you would like to share? Any exciting announcements? Your final 30 seconds on the show.
Um, Go to the website, grab the messaging guides. Everything we do is open source for a reason. That includes not just messaging guidance, but also ads, which you can watch for fun. And the other thing that I would say is that if you want to be involved politically, go local, go local, go local, go local. So figure out where in your local community, whether you're in the US or not, there are groups that are doing the grassroots work of contesting for power and actually putting agency in the hands of the people to whom it has been intentionally denied. You can get a lot more done. There's a lot more bang for your buck and for your hour of time locally.
Thank you so much, Anat Shenker-Osorio. It was an honor to host you today. If you want to support Remote Daily, join us again next week.